In this video, we're going to be looking at the mechanics of adding and subtracting fractions as a quick review. So to examine how we would actually go about adding fractions, I have not only written them out on the screen, but I've also drawn them visually. So I'm using the circles again and dividing them up into pieces to spotlight what these fractional portions look like. So I have 3/8 and 3/16. And so you can see how those are very visually distinct pieces of the circle. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is because one of the most common mistakes I see when adding fractions is students will add the numerators together and add the denominators together. So they'll come up with 6 of something, 6, in this case 6/24, which is completely inaccurate. Because if you look at it, I have 3/8, so those are 3 portions of a circle of a certain size, and I have 3/16. I can't really say that there are 6 of one type of piece here, right? These are very different size slices. If this was a pizza we were talking about here, I don't think anyone would try to equate the slices on the left with the slices on the right and convince you that they're the same. You know that you're not eating the same amount of pizza if you're getting one of the smaller slices on the right. So I can't just add them up and say that there are 6 in total. And so this is where it's really important to get a common denominator. I have to be comparing these fractional pieces on equal footing if I'm going to start adding them up. And so what I do here is I recognize that 3/8 is actually the same as 6/16. And so we actually did this on the last video. If I multiply on top and bottom by 2, I end up with 6/16 here. And now I have a common denominator. And the reason why this works is because essentially what I'm doing is I'm taking each eighth and splitting it in half into 16ths so I can determine how many 16ths is equivalent to 3/8. So I've determined now that that's 6/16. Now that they're on equal footing, I'm talking only about 16ths. 6/16 plus 3 more 16ths is going to give me a total of 9/16 overall. The same needs to be done when you're subtracting fractions. You again need to have that common denominator for the same reason. And so here, I can't just do 3/8 minus 3/16. I have to get my common denominator of 16 here and do the subtraction. So 6/16 minus 3/16 leaves me with 3 left over. And so while I don't expect you to ever draw that out visually, every time you're doing a fractions question, it is fundamentally important that you understand why a common denominator is necessary for addition and subtraction. We cannot possibly compare them if they are different sized portions. If I offered someone half of a pizza versus an eighth of a pizza, there's a very clear distinction between those two pieces. And I can't say that a half plus an eighth is 2 of something. You might be able to say, okay, sure, it's 2 pieces of pizza, but it's not 2 equivalent sized pieces of pizza. And so that's why you need that common denominator. You have to be comparing them on equal footing. If I'm talking about one thing that's in eighths, I have to take that half of a pizza and slice it into portions that are of the same size, eighth-sized portions, before I can add them up. And so getting a common denominator should always be your first step when adding or subtracting fractions, and then you can proceed from there to actually evaluate it. Your denominators will not change. After you've got a common denominator, you do not subtract them and have them become 0. That would probably be the second most common mistake with fractions. But you only focus on the numerators. So here I did 6 minus 3 in my numerator, but my denominator stayed the same. So make sure common denominators, you should always be finding them when doing addition and subtraction only. And just a pro tip carrying over from our previous unit, the best common denominator to use is actually the lowest common multiple of the two denominators that you start with. So the lowest common multiple of 8 and 16 just happens to be 16. That's why that was my common denominator. So if you're ever trying to look for a common denominator and you think you're finding one that's bigger and less convenient, look for the LCM of those two numbers. It will really help you out a lot.